welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore, and it's good to be with you again this week. Friday night in the big town. It is June 21st. This is episode 269 of Let's Pod This. It is one day past the summer solstice of this year, and that means, that means that 2024 is almost halfway over. We're just about a week out from reaching the midway point of this year, and I, for one, am not remotely prepared for the year to be half over, because that means we've got a lot of work to do. Listeners, this week was an election. You may be aware, you may have voted, I hope. Some of you were new poll workers for the first time. Shout out to my dad, who got to be a poll worker for the first time. We had breakfast this morning. He told me all about it. He was very jazzed, very exciting. It sounded like a great experience. With the exception that turnout was not great. Now, if you're a first-time poll worker, that's probably okay. Gives you some space to practice and work through some things. But in the spirit of democracy, not great, right? Not ideal. So we're going to talk about the numbers. We're going to talk about winners and losers. Then we're going to talk about what this means, what the implications might be for this. And this is our best guess, right? We've got a lot of year left to go, a lot of election season left to ride. But first, let's get into those numbers. All right, so on the ballot this week for the primary election, a quick caveat, a quick reminder, which I'm sure I will reference several times, and that's that Oklahoma has partially closed primaries, right? So in our system, Republicans can only vote in Republican primaries, Democrats can only vote in Democratic primaries, Libertarians can only vote in Libertarian primaries, and independent voters like myself are a bit homeless. Thankfully, one party right now, the Democratic Party of Oklahoma, allows independents to vote in their primaries. The other parties do not. That is a decision that each party makes every 2 years. As an independent voter, on behalf of the other roughly 400,000 independent voters in this state, I appreciate that at least one party is willing to let us vote. It would be great if all parties would be willing to let us vote. It would be great, in my opinion, if we had open primaries, completely open primaries, top 2, top 4, top 5, something like that, where everybody, every voter, regardless of the voter's party affiliation, gets to vote in shaping who appears on the ballot. Why? Because we're more than a party. Man, that's why. Because political parties in today's environment mean less than they used to. Anybody can choose to affiliate. I could change my party affiliation to any party and no one can stop me, right? The parties don't get to choose who is in their parties. We as voters get to choose. That means they're real weak. It means parties don't have a lot of say over some of that stuff. They try to block where they can. They try to prevent you from voting in primaries. Ultimately, what it means is that often our choice as voters is greatly diminished. For example, the only statewide race that was on the ballot this week was a statewide primary for the Republican nominee for the Corporation Commission, right? So the Corporation Commission is a three-person commission, 3 commissioners. They're each elected statewide, just like the governor, just like U.S. senators, statewide election. Those 3 members of the Corporation Commission basically oversee the energy companies, right? Like in the common parlance or shorthand, it's more nuanced than that, but that'll get you there. All right, they oversee the energy companies, including utilities. It's a big fucking deal. It's a very important role. Commissioner Bob Anthony, who has served, I think, for his full 18 years, is term limited. He's not on the ballot. And so it was a 3-way race for that. But because it is a Republican primary, only Republican voters were allowed to vote. The race was won by Brian Bingman. He will now face a Democrat, Harold Spalding, and a Libertarian, Chad Williams, in November. So everyone will get to vote in that race in November. It will be a 3-way race there as well. In that race, in the primary, in the Republican primary, there were only about 237,000 votes cast. So this is as a metric of assessing turnout statewide. If every Republican in the state who is registered to vote could have voted, right? they didn't. And so the 237,000 votes represents roughly 20% turnout, right? So the one race that was on the ballot in every county was this race. And turnout for that race alone was only about 20% of registered Republicans. I have a lot of friends who are registered as independents or Democrats or libertarians, and many of them didn't have any kind of election, right? Like if they didn't have a Democratic primary in their location where they live, then they probably didn't get to vote, right? Libertarians, there's only about 20,000 of them that are registered, but they didn't, to my knowledge, didn't have any contested seats where there was 2 libertarians running. And so there just wasn't as many opportunities to vote as we had hoped. And when you look at the results of even the legislative races, a lot of them, turnout was around 1,600, 1,800 votes for a House race. And in a House seat, there's roughly 40,000 people in there, and about half of those are registered to vote. But you realize that it's like we're in the 10 to 15% turnout rate for a lot of these races, which is pretty disappointing. So we talked about the statewide race, kind of moving down the ballot. All the congressional incumbents sailed to victory by and large, right? Like even the one that has been on TV and the news a lot, Tom Cole, had a well-funded challenger, and Paul Bondar, I believe his name was, a gentleman who may or may not live in Texas. Tom Cole defeated him handedly, as was expected. Cole, a very powerful member of Congress, a long-term incumbent, and well-financed, really just took him to the cleaners. Paul Bondar, who largely self-funded his campaign, is out a great deal of money. Moving into, and one other note on the congressional races, many of them, I don't know if all of them, but I think at least 3 or 4 of the 5 congressional seats will be on the ballot in November with a Republican and a Democratic challenger, a Republican incumbent and a Democratic challenger. Some of those, I think, also have independent candidates, maybe even a libertarian. I don't know. I don't remember what my spreadsheet says. I didn't pull it up before this because Washington politics make me nauseous. That's why. But here at home, on the here at home in the legislative races, we have some surprise winners and losers. Let's talk about the winners first, all right? Senate District 11, former House member Regina Goodwin won that seat. She has no Republican challenger, so she's won. She's in the Senate now. Senate District 48, previously held by George Young. Nikki Nice won that. She defeated Connie Johnson. There's no challenger from another party, and so Nikki is now in the Senate. Senate District 46, Mark Mann beat Sam Worgan-Grimaldo for the Democratic nomination by a pretty narrow margin, only like 165 votes. So Mark will now go on to the general election in November. He's a Republican challenger, Charles Barton, and an independent challenger, David Pilchman. House District 88, Ellen Pogmiller beat out Nicole Maldonado and Paula Sofia to outright win the nomination. A lot of folks expected there to be a runoff there because there's 3 candidates, but Ellen got more than 50%, so she wins that outright. And I don't remember if she has a challenger or if she has won entirely. I would assume there's a challenger, but I forget. There's an independent. Yes, Bobby McCollum. So Ellen will face him in November. House District 99, A.J. Pittman defeated Brittany Grant, so A.J. retains her seat. House District 100, the incumbent Marilyn Stark easily beat her challenger, a Republican, and Representative Stark will now face Shantae Gilmore, who won the Democratic nomination over Cindy Parrish in HD 100. I think HD 100 might be one of the most competitive seats in the state. It'll be very interesting to watch that. That part of town is changing dramatically. It's like in northwest Oklahoma City, Bethany area out there. My parents used to live in HD 100. They don't anymore, but it's one of those races that for whatever reason, I've always paid close attention to, and I will again this year. I don't get to vote in it, but I can watch it on the internets. Some big losses, though. I think some really interesting races here. Perhaps most interesting is that in Senate District 13, which is Ada, Greg McCourtney, Senator Greg McCourtney, friend of the show, been on the show a few times. He was essentially the Senate pro tem elect, right? The Senate had voted him as like they've kind of like vetted the vote. They've said we're going to vote him in to be pro tem next year once Senator Treat is gone. However, McCourtney lost his primary to a man named Jonathan Wingard, I believe. McCourtney lost by just 262 votes. Very close race. So not only will McCourtney not be pro tem, he won't even be in the Senate. And that really shakes things up. Likewise, Senator Jessica Garvin in Senate District 43 lost her primary by about 600 votes. Senate District 25, Jeff Boatman, lost by a pretty large margin. I know the education community was upset about this. I saw tweets about that. I think he lost with he had 43% to 57% of the challenger. And then in the House District 33, incumbent John Talley honestly got walloped like 60-40 by a woman named Molly Jenkins. So 4 incumbents that have been around for a while and I think many thought were pretty safe or well-liked got beat. In most cases, they're not the only ones who lost, but those are 4 notable ones. And I think they all lost to someone further to their right. So these were all Republicans who lost to someone who campaigned to be more conservative than the incumbents, which I think is interesting. And we'll come back to that. Runoffs. There are several incumbents who did not lose, but did not win their reelection outright yet. So as an example, in Senate District 3, there was a 3-way race with incumbent Senator Blake Cowboy Stevens, who finished first, but just barely. So he got 38.08%, and the next place finisher got 37.42%. So this is a difference of a little bit less than like 60 votes, like really close. So because neither of them got 50%, they go on to a runoff. House District 32, incumbent Kevin Wallace, who has been the Appropriations and Budget Chair in the House for the last several years, was in a 3-way race. He had 2 Republican challengers. Wallace finished second, so now he goes to a runoff against someone named Jim Shaw. The third candidate in that race only received like 600 votes, so just like 12%. And so that third place candidate really served as a spoiler in that race, right? Like if those votes had gone to either Wallace or Shaw, that person would have won. Similarly, in House District 98, incumbent Dean Davis finished second and now has a runoff, and his was like really close. And so I would argue these races are excellent examples of why we should use ranked choice voting, right? For 2 reasons. One, now these races have to go to another election, right? We have to have a runoff election in August. So there will be even fewer races on the ballot in August, which means turnout will be even lower because fewer and fewer folks will even know there's an election and care enough to go vote, right? Because it's only these districts that have runoffs and not everyone's going to know about it. So, while turnout might have been around 6,000 or 7,000 votes in some of these like Senate seats, I wouldn't be surprised if it's half that for the runoff, which means that like a smaller and smaller portion of the electorate are choosing who wins, right? Which is not representative, to be sure. However, if we had a different system, if we had a system that used ranked choice voting in which you have an election and instead of just picking one person only, you rank all the candidates that you want to in order of preference. So you might say, I like, candidate A the most, candidate C the second most, candidate B the third most. You rank them 1, 2, 3. And then if your first place choice loses and they're the last place finisher, your votes kind of get like redistributed to your second place. And so in some of these cases, For the example, the race in HD 32 with Wallace and Shaw and the third place candidate whose name I forgot to write down, the third place guy only got 633 votes. So he would be eliminated, and those 633 votes would be redistributed to whomever the voters chose as the second most popular, the second choice on their ballots, right? And so some would go to Wallace, some would go to Shaw, some might not go to anybody. If the voter didn't choose to rank anybody, then they would just be thrown out. And that means that we would know then like which one of these candidates won without having to pay for another election. And that alone, cost savings alone, turnout alone, like those are strong reasons to use ranked choice voting. It is easier for voters, gets the job done quicker, easier, cheaper. These are all things we like. Also allows voters' preferences to be more fully captured, right? Like if I ask you, dear listener, let's say we're going to go to Roxy's Ice Cream. We're walking up and I say, what kind do you want? And you say, I want cinnamon. I'm like, okay, what if they don't have cinnamon? Okay, they don't have cinnamon. Give me chocolate. If they don't have that, give me vanilla. Great. I can go in and, you can order, and you kind of already know what your preference is because you ranked them. I want cinnamon, then I want chocolate, then I want vanilla. So you know what it is. And if they were out of cinnamon and you got chocolate, you'd still feel okay, right? Because that was something you wanted. That's very different than saying, I want cinnamon. And if they're out of that, then you end up with like strawberry mint or something you didn't want at all. Like, hang on, I didn't even want that. Right. So ranked choice voting can be very effective at more fully capturing your preferences and ultimately resulting in a winner that is the consensus candidate for most voters in that district. To say nothing about the fact that ranked choice voting, by its very nature, because it does more fully capture voters' preferences, in the research, time and time again, not just in research, in real life practice, has resulted in more women and more people of color winning elections. Sad as it might be, many voters are still reluctant to rank a female candidate first, but in some cases they might rank them second. And the way that the votes end up happening, that encourages more women to run, and it means more women win. In fact, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, they've got an all-female city council for the first time ever. I think the first city in America to do it. Very exciting. Anyway, I digress. That's neither here nor there, nor certainly not in Oklahoma. Some other notable races that I wanted to acknowledge. In Senate District 17, incumbent Shane Jett avoided a runoff by a mere 11 votes. He got 50.08% of the vote. So he won outright, but just barely. Interestingly enough, the second place finisher was Ron Sharp, who previously represented that district. Shane Jett beat Ron Sharp to win a few years ago. Sharp came back trying to challenge him again, but lost just by a little bit. Up in the Panhandle, Senate District 27, Senator Casey Murdoch, he won by just about 400 votes, so pretty close. In Senate District 47, which has been represented by Pro Tem Greg Treat, who is term limited. So it was a three-way race there. And it was really fascinating. All three candidates received nearly equal numbers of votes. Like it was almost a third. One candidate got the highest vote total was 1,889 votes. Second was 1,579, and then 1,568. So, but like 10 votes between the bottom two, and then only a few hundred for the top one there. Really close. So that'll go to a runoff between the two highest. But still, just the fact that it was an almost even split was really interesting. I saw somebody post on Facebook a sheriff's race. I want to say it was Carter County, but I might be wrong. But it was a sheriff's race that tied. It was an absolute tie. Like an exact even number of votes. I've never seen that before in Oklahoma. Obviously, that'll go, well, they'll do a recount first just to make sure. But because and I guess if it's just two candidates, then whoever wins, if there's a recount and there's even one vote that changes the outcome. So if you think your vote doesn't matter, here are a bunch of examples to the contrary, right? Can you imagine voting in an election and someone wins by 1 vote or loses by 1 vote and you didn't vote, how you might feel about that? Ooh. And you don't know until you vote, right? Like that could be any race. You just don't know until you vote. We all think, well, it's going to be a landslide. Like you don't know. If everybody shows up, a lot of these races are way more competitive than you think. You should always vote. You just never know. Senate District 15 down in Norman, previously held by Rob Standridge. He is term limited. His wife, Lisa, was running. I believe it's his wife. It was a 6-way race, 6 Republicans vying for that seat. Lisa Standridge finished first, but only got 34% of the vote. And with 6 candidates, I mean, it's unlikely that anyone's going to get 50%. So that'll go to a runoff. House District 90, previously held by House Majority Leader John Eccles, or Floor Leader John Eccles. His son, Matt, ran but lost. There was only 1,600 votes in that race. Matt lost 46% to 54% in that to a winner whose name is Emily Geiss, or Gice. I'm not sure on the pronunciation. I don't know anything about her other than her name is spelled with a G, and I don't know if it's a hard or a soft G. But she will proceed to the general. I believe there's a Democrat in that race. I don't know if there's anybody else. All right, so there's a lot of numbers. There's a lot of races. There's a lot of uncertainty about this. A lot of hot takes on Twitter, on the old Twitter-do X platform. Some much fewer hot takes on Threads. If you're on Threads, give us a follow. We're Let's Fix This Okay over on Threads. I'm Hello Andy Moore on all of these platforms as well. I don't post a lot on these anymore. It's a weird time in social media. But among those hot takes, one of them stood out to me. It was from Donnell Harder, who's a longtime Republican operative. I know she's worked on Governor Stitt's campaigns in the past and worked in his office for a while. I'm not sure if she still does or not. I think she's got her own consulting firm. But she pointed out that a lot of these upset seats, right? McCourtney, Garvin, Talley, some of these seats where we'll call them like establishment Republicans, were defeated by challengers. And those challengers in those races apparently had been endorsed by the governor. We don't track gubernatorial endorsements here, but this is what Donnell pointed out. That she said something along the lines of like, the governor's endorsements make a difference. And I don't know. Like, I haven't talked to Donnell about this. I haven't even looked to see how many races the governor gave an endorsement. If it was only these races and that made a difference, that's one thing. If he endorsed in a whole bunch of races and we're only talking about the ones where his chosen candidates won, well, that's skewing the data a little bit. I wonder, though, that may play a role, especially in these rural areas where like the governor's popularity is higher than it is in some of the metro areas. That very well may be the case. From what I understand, a lot of these challengers are political newcomers. They are not perennial candidates. Many of them have not even run before. And when you step back and look at the whole picture, not just of Oklahoma, but the whole picture of what's happening in democracy in America and across the globe, we see a very strong anti-incumbent sentiment. I'm not going to say bias, but like sentiment. And in fact, 538 Politics podcast did an episode about this like just yesterday. I'm not even through listening to it yet. But I was already thinking about this, and I felt validated, honestly, that ABC News Media would have an episode of their podcast making the same argument that I had been making quietly to myself. And that's that, man, voters are sick of politicians. And that is sometimes a lazy way to operate. Right? Like, it makes a lot of sense. It is easy to use politicians as a punching bag. And in some cases, they deserve it. Sometimes they make boneheaded decisions. Sometimes they're in the news for very terrible reasons. Scandals involving barbecue or, blank checks to families to buy video game systems. And, there's all this stuff that we know happens. Corruption, incompetence, and just like dislike and disagreement with policy decisions, even if they're done well on merits, right? You might just disagree with it. It is easy for us to look at politicians and to dislike them because it's easy to create an us versus them sentiment. And I will acknowledge at the top of this conversation that I say this as someone who has run an organization called People Not Politicians, right? And I think back on that. That was not saying politicians are bad. We were saying that people should draw lines, like we should draw the district lines, not the politicians who serve in that. And part of the reason we chose that name is that that sentiment is very popular, right? Oklahoma is a very populist state, and we're not alone across the country. You've got voters not politicians and citizens not politicians. There's this like theme that emerges that like, okay, voters are fed up. Like we see a system that doesn't work. We see the people who seem to be benefiting from it, right? Those who are making millions on stock sales or purchases because they've got insider information. We've got lawsuits and criminal cases and just general distrust of institutions in our country in a way we haven't had maybe ever. But we also know, friends, if we're honest with ourselves, that politicians are not a block, right? They're not just all one entity. When you ask voters who say they don't like politicians, when you ask them about specific politicians, like who represents them, the polling is quite different, right? Someone you can ask, polling generally is like congressional approval rating is like super low, right? Like 19%, 15%, something like that of people approve of Congress, a very tiny fraction. But when you ask voters, what about your member of Congress? They're like, oh, he's all right. She's not bad. And they'll rate them like much, much, much higher, like 50, 60 points higher. Okay, well, there's a big disconnect there. And I struggle with this myself, or at least I intentionally wrestle with this myself, and I hope that you will too, right? That when we are frustrated or disgusted by politicians, we must reflect a little bit on not politicians as a broad category, but on specific individuals and specific policy decisions, right? Specific votes they made. And we also have to think about what do our friends and neighbors think about this? Chances are, if you're listening to this podcast, you are much more politically engaged, civically engaged, knowledgeable, or at least curious, right? Like we internally we talk about our audiences being people who are politically curious in Oklahoma. You have some frame of reference where I could rattle off a list of races and names of state legislators, and you probably knew several of them. And that is very different than most people in the state, right? If you go to your workplace and you drop those same names, I'll bet you dollars to donuts that your colleagues don't know who you're talking about, right? If you work in Oklahoma City and you mention State Senator Casey Murdoch from Felt, Oklahoma, just way up in the panhandle, most folks aren't going to know who that is. Maybe you do, because I feel like we mentioned him a lot on the podcast. I don't know why. But I like, just remember that your perspective is different than a lot of the other voters out there. I would argue, or at least I hope, right, that the more that we collectively can make a movement in society towards an electorate that is more informed and more engaged, that would be better, right? That a more informed and more engaged electorate will be more participatory, like they'll vote at higher rates, they will engage at higher rates, and they will, in doing so, hold elected officials more accountable for the votes they take, for the policies they push, and they become more responsive as elected officials. And so like the more engaged we are, the more responsive they are, the more engaged we are, the more responsive they are. And we create a system that is built on a positive feedback loop rather than what we have right now, which is we become disengaged. They feel empowered or emboldened because they only hear from a few. And if those few are telling them what they want to hear, then it again becomes a like self-fulfilling prophecy, but in the opposite direction from what many of us might want. However, man, like, I also get it, right? Like, it is impossible and perhaps even unwise to care a lot about everything. And I'm not saying not to care. Please don't mishear me on that. We've got to care. I can't in good conscience drive down the street and see my neighbors living in tents or begging for food or money and think that I shouldn't care. It is heartbreaking when you see the plight of your neighbors, when you see school children who can't access food in the summertime because an elected official refused to apply for a program for free food. It boggles my mind. And it stirs my soul in ways that I think are important, right? So we have to care. But right now, the media, this is not a bad thing, but like the media we consume, the news, the entertainment, everything makes us feel like we are supposed to care about everything all the time, right? Yesterday, Instagram served me a video of Scott and Khloe Kardashian, Scott, whatever his last name is, and he was talking about his diet and eating Hawaiian rolls and drinking ginger ale, and I can't forget it now, and I'm so mad because like there's not an ounce of me that gives a shit what that guy eats or drinks or whatever in his health. Like I don't know him. That's a whole other thing. But I was scrolling on the app and it served it to me and I watched it and now it's in my head, and that is displacing the space that I should be using for something else good, right? Now, if that's your self-care, if, being interested in Hollywood gossip or whatever is like how you decompress, okay, I get that too. Like self-care is important too. But I think we've unintentionally created a culture amongst ourselves where we say you have to care about everything that's important for 3 seconds at a time, right? You have to share that post that someone else shared about Gaza. You have to share that post about schools. You have to watch this video from a congressional hearing from 6 months ago where Mark Wayne Mullen threatened the Teamsters guy and challenged him to a fight, right? Like you have to you have to know everything that's happening in every state legislative race. You have to care about every policy priority for every organization that you believe is doing good work. And none of us have the capacity to do that. Like that is not a normal human capacity that we have evolved to do at any point in human history. What I'm asking, or what I'm suggesting, I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm suggesting to all of us that we take stock of what the things are in our life that we care about the most. What are the things that you believe you can make a reasonable contribution toward? What are the things you can control, if you want to use the serenity prayer here, right? So know the difference between what you can and can't control. And then to actually give of yourself in a meaningful way towards those things. For some of you, that might be candidate elections in your area or somewhere in the state, right? You might, through whatever reason, you grew up with this person and you think they're a great candidate, or you thought they're a terrible candidate, or whatever, and you want to get involved. But it might also be that you believe it's important to hold space for your colleague at work that, overshares about her family drama at home, but you realize in her oversharing that it's because she doesn't really have anybody to talk to. And I'm not saying you got to be their therapist, but maybe you save space to listen to them and help connect them with somebody. Or you're that person that makes a suggestion that says, you know what, I went to therapy and it was really helpful when I had a similar situation. Is that something you've ever thought about? Maybe it's taking time to listen to the perspective of your colleague, your friend, your uncle, your neighbor, someone that you're nervous to talk to about certain things because you think you might disagree with them about politically. It is strange to me that we are afraid to disagree with somebody. We are afraid to stand in front of someone who says something with which we disagree. Just because they disagree doesn't necessarily mean anything about you. Now, there are exceptions, right? I'm not saying that you as a Jewish person need to stand there and just listen to someone spout anti-Semitic hate speech, right? I'm not saying that you as a Muslim person need to sit there and listen to like Islamophobic hate speech. I'm not LGBT hate. I'm not saying that, right? Like, don't actively put yourself in harm's way. But I think that we collectively spend a lot of time worrying about the horse race of elections. Who's ahead in the polls, who wins, who loses, and not enough time thinking about what do the people around me need? How can I use my relationships? How can I use my connections, my position, my influence, however small it might be, but how can I use that to make a positive difference in the world around me? Voters in Oklahoma and America and the world are frustrated, are fed up with politics as usual, with politicians as usual, because that gap has grown between politicians who are interested in running to do the right thing for their community and politicians who are running to win re-election. And when the election gets put ahead of the policy, of the positive outcome they can make, we have fundamentally changed the incentives that drive political life. When candidates are incentivized to appeal to a small minority of voters, right? You don't have to win the majority of voters in your district. You only have to win a majority of voters who turn out on primary election day on a Tuesday in June, right? In a district of 40,000 people, you only have to win 800. That incentive is very different, right? We want to believe that the moment someone's elected, they recognize that they now represent everybody in that district, everyone who voted for them and everyone who voted for the other person and everyone who didn't vote at all. And while that may be factually true, in practice, it does not always play out the same way. It doesn't play out in the way that I wish it would, right? And so we have two levers to pull here, right? One is to design new systems that change the incentive of politicians to better align with the needs of the public, of their constituents, right? And we can do this by changing systems. Like we can open primaries, right? We can consider voting processes that are more inclusive, right? Universal mail ballots, automatic voter registration, alternative voting methods, ranked choice voting or approval voting, other things like that. I think there's some ways to that we can change the system to change the incentives for politicians. And we can also participate more. Many of you have heard me tell a story about when Let's Fix This first started. I was talking to a state legislator, and they said that two things matter at the state capitol: money and influence. And I chuckled. I said, I don't have any money. Like, I've worked in nonprofits my whole life. And he said, no, but you've got influence. And I said, no, I don't. Like, I'm just a guy. And it was the day after our first Let's Fix This event. And we had about 100 people that came to the Capitol, which I thought was small potatoes. But apparently, so few people, so few voters of their own volition just go up there with the intent of building relationships with lawmakers, that when you do, even 100 people in a state of 4 million, 100 people go up there, it changes the dynamics of the relationships there. And he said, I said, I don't have any influence. And he said, you got 100 people to come to the Capitol who wouldn't have come otherwise. And I said, all I did was invite them. And he was like, that's all it took. And I think about that often, not for me, but I think about what it means for each of us, right? If each of you who is listening to this in your car or in your home, or you're running or you're at the grocery store or whatever, if you can hear my voice right now, there are people in your life with whom you have influence that you have not yet influenced, right? There are people that you could nudge gently, subtly, lovingly towards being more involved. And that can look like a lot of things. That could be talking to them about the election, asking if they voted, right? You don't have to ask who they voted for. Just like, hey, did you vote on Tuesday? And that puts them on the spot. Maybe that's too confrontational. Okay. Maybe they lie to you and you know it, right? That's fine too, right? Like, this isn't a gotcha moment. This is a opportunity to start a conversation. Maybe you bring up this topic of anti-incumbent sentiment. You know, you can say, man, I find myself being really frustrated with the politicians these days. How about you? See what they say, right? You don't have to go down like a rabbit hole of complaining. You could also bring it around and be like, you know, I'm really frustrated, but I also recognize it takes a lot of time and effort and like selflessness to run for office. It may take a little bit of narcissism as well to believe that you could win, but it takes a lot of selflessness to run as well. It is hard. Who are all these people that volunteer and knock doors and give money? Like, there are thousands of people who believe in this experiment in democracy in America enough to give their time and their treasure year after year after year. That's not insignificant. Maybe you talk to them and you nudge them to get involved. Maybe you don't even bring it up with them. Maybe you don't say anything to that person, but you decide you're going to organize a backyard barbecue and you're going to invite your 6 closest friends, people with whom you feel safe, who you could tell them if you were having relationship problems. You would tell them if you were having parenting struggles, right? You might tell them you're depressed. Like, these are the people that you trust. And those might not be the people that you've talked about politics with. Or they're people with whom you're okay complaining, but you don't always talk about the positive aspect of this. We can complain without talking about solutions. And maybe you want to talk about solutions. So you invite your 6 or 8 closest friends over for a potluck, a barbecue in the backyard, and you want to invite someone like me from Let's Fix This or from another civic organization and say, you know what, I want to have a dinner party and I want to find out what we can do about voting in our community. I want to have a barbecue that talks about education policy and public education. I'm going to invite someone from, the Parent Legislative Advocacy Committee or from OEA. I want to talk about poverty and how we can combat it. I want to talk about housing and homelessness and what our community can do about it. I want to get 6 or 8 people together and have a little town hall meeting at the gazebo in our neighborhood or at the park. I want to talk about the shortage of childcare. I want someone else who isn't struggling with this. Well, I want someone else who isn't me who's struggling with this to come and like just broaden our horizons a little bit. I want to use our time together with our friends to celebrate, to fellowship, to commune, and to get better, right? To be better citizens in this community. This is a big ask. I recognize that. I know I said it's a suggestion, and yes, now it's evolved to an ask, but maybe it's a challenge. I don't know. Choose your adjective or adverb. I'm not a language professor here. Choose your word. What I'm saying is all of us, myself included, right, can find ways to inject more humanity, love, humility into our role in society. And I think about this issue after every election, right? The election is over. People have won. People have lost. Democracy moves forward. How do I move forward with it? In this new world, what is my role? And we are called to a role that is more than anger and vitriol. There is a place for that, and we must stand up for justice. We must stand up for righteousness. We must stand against hate every single chance we get. We also must find ways to build bridges, to deepen relationships, to invest in the future of what this great state of Oklahoma can and should be. And it's hard. It's fucking hard, right? There are weeks that you feel like you can't do it. Take that week off. You don't have to do it every day, right? But if each day, even 3 times a week, if you sat down on your couch and you said, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to scroll Instagram for the next 15 minutes, and instead of scrolling Instagram for just 15 minutes, you use that 15 minutes to send a text message to 3 people, telling them that you care about them, that you love them, that you're glad they're a part of your community, that you want to work with them and find new ways to build a better community together. You do that 3 times a week. 3 times 3 is 9. It's 9 people a week, right? Find an extra 10. Make it 10. 10 people a week. That's 40 people a month, right? Like suddenly, like we're adding up here, right? That's 500 people a year. We are starting to use our influence in massively important ways, right? I will end with this thought. For any of you who have participated in any kind of multi-level marketing situation, right? Whether you grew up doing home interiors, or your mom did home interiors like my mom did, or Mary Kay, or Arbonne, or Lonneberger baskets, or I don't even know what all they do now. Those like wrap things, weight loss wrap things that go around your body. Is that a thing? I don't know. If you've been to any kind of party, Tupperware or otherwise, where people were trying to sell you something at their living room, you can do this, right? If you want, hell, I'll buy Tupperware. You invite your friends over. Everyone gets a free bowl, and we'll talk about democracy. I don't have a good name for this, right? Tupperware for democracy? Fuck it, I don't know. If that's what it takes to get your friends over to have this conversation, we can make this happen. I'll bring makeup. We can all do a face mask and talk about voting. I don't even care. Whatever it takes, let's be creative and make this happen. Even if you think, oh, well, all my friends probably think like me and we're not going to be additive. You don't know, right? They might care about public education. It is the most motivating issue in our state at any given moment, but it's not the only issue, right? And chances are not all of your friends are as involved as you would like. If you're a teacher, there's a good chance a lot of your friends that are teachers don't vote. They might act like it, but they may not vote. that goes for everybody. I've had people who were deep in the weeds, seem to be activists extraordinaire, always posting about it, always talking about it. You look in their voting history and it is not what you think, right? There's work to be done. We don't have to shame people. We will when necessary, but we don't have to. But there are ways for us to build relationships with one another, to think, to strategize, to come together in times of need, and to make a plan for how we are going to change this state. We can do it. No matter how you're feeling about the election on Tuesday, no matter how you're feeling about the election coming in November, Oklahoma will be here. Democracy will be here as long as you are willing to be here and to fight for it. I'm here. I hope that you will stand with us. All right. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. I am working on a panel of other guests to discuss election results with a bit more insight and poise than I have, but I appreciate you hanging with me for these last 51-ish minutes. I hope you have a great weekend. Oklahoma City Pride Alliance Festival is coming up next week. I'm going to be gone for a week or two because we're moving. It's a busy time this summer. July 4th is coming up. We are in civic season. It's an election year. There is reason to party, y'all. Let's make this happen. Go back and listen to this episode again. Think about what I said. Invite your friends over. Let's do face masks. Remember, decisions are made by those who show up. Have a good week.